Good evening, everyone. Come on in, make yourselves comfortable. We'll just give it a minute for everyone to get set up and make themselves at home. Just one more moment or two to get everyone into the call. Welcome to tonight's NUJ Talk-In Defend Public Service Broadcasting. Over the past year, work at the BBC, ITV, Channel 4, S4C has felt newly urgent, newly important, as the waves of COVID infections crashed over the UK and over the globe. Public service broadcasters have risen to the challenge of keeping people informed, educated, literally in the case of all those homeschooled children, and entertained. Where would the nation be without programs like Bake Off, I May Destroy You, Quiz, Dominic Cummings' Rose Garden press conference, just to keep our spirits up. But of course, as audiences have grown over the past year, streaming giants are still peeling off younger viewers. The debate over the future of the licence fee limps on, our newsrooms are being cut back, and the government is questioning whether public service broadcasting is needed at all. Does Downing Street really want a hedge fund tycoon to buy up Channel 4 and turn it into Netflix for Conservatives? To ponder this state of affairs, we're joined by Sir Peter Bazalgette, Chair of ITV, who has described 2020 as public service broadcasting's finest hour. Joe Stevens, the Shadow Culture Secretary, who's been campaigning to save free TV licences for the over 75s. Owen Evans, Chief Executive of S4C, whose personal journey into public service broadcasting was headlined on Wales Online recently as "I got expelled from school and worked as a shepherd. Now I run one of Wales' main TV channels." Patrick Barwise, Emeritus Professor of Management and Marketing at London Business School and co-author of The War Against the BBC, a title which I think gives you some clues to his perspective. And Patrick, I know you do have to leave early this evening. And Keating Síocháin, an Irish language broadcaster at RTÉ, which is an organisation described as burning by one of Ireland's top TV bosses because of the impact of streaming services. Now, before we hear from this illustrious panel, a little bit of housekeeping. Please say hello and introduce yourself to everyone else using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We'll also post a link there to the captioning service if you need it. And most importantly, if you have a question for the panel, there is a Q&A button also at the bottom of your screen. Please put your question in there and I'll endeavour to read some out as we go along. Now, to start, I want to give the panel a minute each to tell us what is the main thing they think public service broadcasting needs defending on. Are we at an existential crisis moment or are things kind of rolling along? Patrick, would you like to go first? Or you'll need to unmute yourself, Patrick, in classic Zoom style.
The last gig I did was there were two members of the House of Lords who did that, and one of them then dropped an off F-bomb, but I'm not going to do that. There are lots of challenges, but the big one is money. All the PSBs have cost and revenue pressures driven by the streamers competing for content and for viewers. The commercial PSBs also have Facebook and Google hoovering up advertising, but the financial pressure on the BBC is much worse because its funding has been cut so deeply. If the BBC's public funding had simply kept pace with general inflation since 2010, it would now be 43% higher. That's nearly 1.4 billion per annum. So the big issue is money, especially for the BBC.
Thank you. Keating, do you want to go next?
Sorry, no, couldn't find the cursor there for a second. Yeah, I mean it's money. I mean it's the two problems RTÉ has are revenue decline and changing audience preferences. RTÉ is funded dually, so there's the public element through TV license fee, and then there's the commercial through advertising. As Patrick mentions, advertising since 2008 has dropped by 25%, and then big tech grew up and grew bigger and bigger, and there's no stopping, and it's hoovering everything in between. They are, however, symptoms of perhaps a wider ailment that RTÉ is suffering with, and that's kind of government inaction, fueled a little bit by government antipathy, depending on who's in charge. So, you know, without legislative change revolved around solving the funding model, you know, addressing the symptoms just won't cut it.
Thank you. Peter?
Thanks, Rebecca, and good evening, everyone. I will come to money, but I'm going to say something else first. It's possible that most TV, if not all TV signals, will be distributed via the internet rather than over DTT, satellite, or cable. Well, cable, yes, via the internet. So if all TV signals are distributed via the internet in 10 years' time, that means the gatekeepers for the TV signals will be the supranational monopolies who already dominate, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons. These are foreign-owned companies. There's nothing wrong with that. They're in many cases investors in this country. But if they choose not to give something prominence, or if they choose to take 30% of its revenue, or if they choose not to share data with it, it's in great trouble. So the public service broadcasters, if they can't be found or get access to the internet of the future, they're finished. That's why, for me, the biggest threat and the most important thing is the legislative change that updates the 2003 Communications Act to give prominence to public service broadcasters on the internet, guarantee access and fair value for their programming, which is valuable for those platforms that will be hosting it in the future. When it comes to money, I just wanted to make one simple point about the BBC. There's a proper debate about the best way of getting the BBC's money, and Paddy Barwise in his recent book was very clear that it may be the license fees days are numbered and we need some other way, and he looked at various ways in the book. What I would say is, for the BBC to thrive, it needs a hypothecated source of revenue. It needs a dedicated source of revenue, whether it's from taxation or the council tax or whatever it is, and we can have a debate about that. It needs hypothecated revenue to thrive, and it needs to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good evening, everyone. Is it a threat? Is it a challenge, or is it both? And are there opportunities for PSBs? I always think that there are opportunities arising out of every challenge that you face. I agree, money. I agree with Peter about prominence, but the third thing for me that will influence this is obviously the politics. And what I am happy about and reassured about is that there is overwhelming support for the principle of public service broadcasting, or public service media as we're being encouraged to call it. The recent DCMS Select Committee report into the future of PSB found that the support for the principles of PSB remains really, really strong. And for me, that's the platform on which to stand to meet and defeat the threats and the challenges, and it also creates the opportunities. And so I would like to see PSBs working together to maximise their own bargaining power in the future. We see good examples. We've seen good examples already with BritBox and sport, the Six Nations rugby and Channel 4 with the cricket. But, what's the PSB's collective strategy for the future? That's what I'd really like to see.
Thank you. Owen.
Thanks. I mean, you can't avoid money without public, in extreme market failures, as you'll get with Indigenous languages. Without support, then S4C goes, ALBA goes, TG Cahar goes, and another huge facet of the UK goes. I think pace is another one. The arguments over prominence have really been going on for a long time, and the ability to make decisions quickly, which you do need to do these days, is just seems to be absent. And I think Peter's absolutely right. The ability to control platforms and have a say about how they're controlled is paramount even to S4C as much as ITV. And I think the last one is political interest, to Joe's point. Globalization is spreading, and the US leads so much of the cultural influence on the UK. And unless we get a grip on how this is going to develop, we could become the 51st state. So I think that we really need to think about what's the role of public sector broadcasting, what's the public value it brings. And if we agree that, then it's going to have to be funded somehow.
Thank you, Owen. Well, I think we've got quite a bit of agreement there. Money definitely is the number one topic, technological change, and then also government attitudes. So let's start with the money. Patrick, you seem to have written a definitive book on this. You've gone through all the options, and I think you plumped for a household levy as your preferred choice. Would you just talk us through how you came to that conclusion?
Well, the first question is, does the license fee have a future? And then you have to say, what are the alternatives and is there a better alternative? Now, in the long term, my answer would be no. We need to stop linking the BBC's core funding to household ownership of a TV set in today's multi-device world. If I were the BBC, as soon as the next funding deal is agreed, I'd commission an independent review of the options, similar to the Peacock review of BBC advertising in the 1980s. What are those options? They are advertising, subscriptions, general taxation, or some kind of universal household levy, as in Germany and now Ireland. You could combine two funding sources, but that would be expensive because each one has different fixed costs. Now, advertising is a no-no for the reasons given by Peacock, which were the impact on the BBC's incentives and the impact on other media. Peacock actually missed two other big reasons. First, advertising involves much higher overheads than the license fee. And secondly, audiences actually dislike commercial interruptions. And Peacock missed both of those in 15 months. What about subscriptions? Very popular with the IEA. Three big problems. First, every relevant device would need conditional access technology to exclude households that haven't paid. It will be many years before subscriptions are technically feasible. Second, we'd lose the BBC's universality, which is a core feature of public service broadcasting. Third, to maintain its content investment, the average subscription price would need to be much, much higher than the license fee. Each subscribing household would have to pay more to cover the lost income from those who chose not to subscribe, but also pay TV overhead costs, sales and marketing, billing, customer services are huge. And if you don't believe me, look at Sky's annual report. General taxation is another option. It would be fine if you can keep the funding level politician-proof and away from the Treasury, but that's a big if. A universal household levy is, to me, the best option. It too would need protection from politicians and the Treasury, but the Germans have shown that that's doable. It could be efficiently collected with council tax or electricity bills, while also enabling it to be progressive, a bit of levelling up. What else can be done to sustain the the PSB's finances? Well, they're all already increasing their commercial income through programme and format sales, new services, and increasingly targeted TV advertising and online advertising. They're jointly lobbying on provenance, as has been mentioned, and to highlight the tech companies' unfair advantages in both regulation and tax. I hope they'll also lobby jointly to increase the number of listed sporting events for which broadcast rights must be offered to universally available free-to-air broadcasters at a reasonable price. The European Super League fiasco should make the case for this easier. I'd also encourage the commercial PSBs to lobby for the commercial airtime minutes per hour to be the same on all TV advertising channels, levelling the playing field with the non-PSBs. Now, the commercial PSBs have always ducked this because they think it's too difficult, but I'd be surprised if it's not worth at least 30 to 40 million a year. And Baz, that's about 20 million a year for ITV straight to the bottom line, which I would have thought would be enough to get your attention. If so,
well, is this money in your gift, Paddy?
It's in the gift of Sky and the other non-PSBs, and surprise, surprise, they have A, resisted it, and B, done some rewriting of history about how these very arcane rules were introduced, compared with which the Schleswig-Holstein question was a mere curtain raiser. So it is difficult, but that's maybe an offline conversation. I think also the PSBs and the NUJ should make much more of the importance of the impartiality rules for broadcast news. And there are three reasons. First, I think this issue has the potential to resonate with the public, especially now. Although they don't know the regulatory rules, they certainly trust broadcast news more than other sources, especially partisan newspapers and social media. Secondly, the contrast with the US has never been greater. There's a link between the 1987 abolition of the fairness doctrine for US broadcast news, the subsequent launch of Fox News and right-wing shock jock radio stations, and the 6th January storming of the Capitol. Of course, social media have hugely reinforced the divisions in US society, but after the 1987 abolition of the fairness doctrine, it was the broadcasters who got there first and created, or certainly reinforced, the divisions which were already there. Now, this isn't just sort of anecdotal or my view. An 18 countries Zurich University study last year found that people in countries with strong PSBs were more resilient to online disinformation and conspiracy theories. Most resilient were the Nordics, closely followed by the UK. The US was last out of 18, with a population, quotes, particularly susceptible to disinformation campaigns, unquote. Of course, there are many other reasons, but the absence of trusted, impartial broadcast news is clearly one of the main ones. Conversely, our impartial broadcast news is, in my view, the single biggest reason why we have the lowest level of vaccine hesitancy of any major country. Let's make that connection. Finally, let me just add that the BBC has typically completely ignored our book and us. As always, it remains both wonderful, infuriating, and very hard to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. To pick up on one thing you mentioned there, you pointed out that Ireland from 2024 will replace the licence fee with a device-independent broadcasting charge. Ciara, would you like to tell us a little bit more about that and the impact that might have?
Yeah, well, I'd have to start by saying that's news to me, but I'll defer to Patrick's superior knowledge. What I do know, what I can tell you about, apart from a specific date of 2024, it may coincide with this, is that in Ireland, the future funding of media, which includes public service broadcasting, but print, broadcast, online, independent, commercial sector media, is currently being examined by the Future of Media Commission. Now, that commission is due to report in September with recommendations to government. The terms of reference are in a way good for public service broadcasting, in that they do make a distinction between public service broadcasters in Ireland, that's RTÉ, and TG4, the Irish language television and some online content company, which is separate from RTÉ, and the public service content providers, so the commercial independent sector. The downside of the terms of reference for that commission is the mammoth task that they have to undertake to try and satisfy. I don't think it'll be possible to satisfy the many competing interests. But for RTÉ, the public service broadcaster, and for TG4, because they are distinct from the rest, it may be more favorable. The impact of what the Commission recommends is entirely dependent back to, again, government. Government will take that, and what or if they do anything with it is anyone's guess. RTÉ's favoured solution would be, as has been mentioned here before, a household charge, possibly collected by the revenue commissioners as opposed to a utility bill, which would reduce evasion rates. Evasion rates in Ireland at the moment on licence fees are in the region of 13 to 14%, amongst the highest in Europe. And I mentioned the greatest threat as being the audience preferences of consuming programming and content. You know, RTÉ is unable to monetize that online, mobile viewership or audience because of the legislation. I think Peter mentioned the 2003 Act in Ireland. Our Act is a 2009 Act, but they all predate not only the Apple iPhone and smart media, but the giant tech social media, which you know, we all know kind of the effect that it's having. So like the BBC, RTÉ is at the mercy of politicians. some of whom are in favour, and we currently have a coalition, and some of the coalition would be sympathetic and others less so to grasping the funding nettle, if you like, changing the legislation. And were they to do that, that would be great, but it will take as long as turning the legislative oil tanker around. So you're talking 2, 3, whatever many years when they decide to do it. The problem, of course, is that it would be seen as another tax. And we had a huge issue with water charges in Ireland recently, and they didn't go down well. And so Brave, the politician who is essentially going to announce that congratulations everyone, in order to save your public service broadcaster, we're going to hit you with a charge.
Thank you very much. So to pick up there, Joe, how brave would you be in terms of revamping funding?
Well, I think the funding is an issue that is obviously current in terms of the BBC at the moment, but I think there are a whole load of other threats that PSBs are facing, and I think a high level of concern is justified, and I'll just give you 3 examples why. You know, all of us here, nobody will forget Dominic Cummings going into number 10 on a stated mission to bash the BBC. Now, Mr. Cummings may have departed, and the threat of decriminalisation of the licence fee, for example, has been seen off for now. But there are plenty of anti-BBC Tory MPs who like nothing more than a daily culture war and a bash the BBC episode of their own. So. But whilst there are things to criticise about the BBC, this isn't responding to the genuine concerns or public demand. And BBC needs to keep pace with change. The incoming chair and director general have been very frank about that. The second thing is that despite Ofcom undertaking its PSB review, and we're waiting to hear them report with that, the government last November set up their PSB advisory panel and populated it with their supporters. That panel hasn't been set up under Cabinet Office guidelines, and so its discussions and advice are entirely secret. They're so secret that the DCMS department claims that to publish minutes of the panel's meetings over the last 6 months would have a chilling effect on further discussions. So none of us know anything about what questions that panel is addressing, what evidence it's looking at, whether anything at all will be made public at the end of it, and even when it finishes its deliberations. And then the third thing, I think, which is creating a high level of concern, particularly after last week, is last week the Secretary of State gave evidence at the DCMS Select Committee and proactively offered up that he has been asked, or he has asked the panel to make recommendations on the privatisation of Channel 4. Now, we know this has always been a pet project of the media minister, John Whittingdale's, but is that really the way to announce, presumably, a serious proposition that they're considering? So, there are 3 things there, which, as well as the issue around funding, I think are real threats and concerns, and that we should all have at the forefront of our mind. On privatisation, it was noticeable that in the Select Committee report, there was no suggestion from that cross-party panel or no suggestion or recommendation that Channel 4 should be privatised. That's a detailed thought-through report. It's been full, it's been transparent, a proper evidence-based process. So we've got these kind of 2 parallel things going on at the same time. And if the government does intend to go ahead with privatisation, you've really got to ask yourself, what's the rationale? What are the drivers? What's the problem that the government is trying to solve by doing this? There's clearly going to be legislation. There's going to be media legislation. We've talked about the need for digital age legislation. The Secretary of State has said he wants it in the next parliamentary session. Privatisation of Channel 4 would need primary legislation. So, we're going to look and we're going to see a broadcasting landscape that is going to be very, very different, I think, maybe in just 2 or 3 years' time. And that's aside from the issue of money and funding and whether or not the licence fee is a sustainable model for the BBC's future.
Rebecca, could I
yes.
just make a point about funding?
Yes, please do.
This applies to commercial television. There's a lot of journalists, probably entirely journalists on this call. I would urge them to study this particular issue very closely. I'm about to mention. Paddy's very busy gifting me advertising minutage, but the question is what you put into those minutes. Now, there is currently the proposal from the newly converted Prime Minister to ban so-called high-fat, sugar and salt advertisements after 9 o'clock on PSB channels, and this will take hundreds of millions of pounds out of commercial television. In case of ITV, it would take more money out than we spend on the very valuable regional news that we produce. Now, obesity is an incredibly serious problem, one we should all be worried about. It's one that ITV cares about as a PSB broadcaster. We give time to advertising, promoting vegetables, eat them to defeat them, promote the Daily Mile, we do all sorts of things. Just now, Joe talked about evidence-based policy making, absolutely first principle. Patrick probably knows the evidence on this. There's been studies done time out of mind on this, and it's because of how advertising works. And Ofcom have done the definitive studies and others have, and it's not going to move the dial. The hard yards for obesity are helping disadvantaged families in deprived communities change their lifestyle. That's hard yards. It's very easy to go in for gesture politics and ban advertising. It might make everybody feel good. It's going to severely damage public service broadcasting. It's not evidence-based, and even the government's own evidence, which frankly is dodgy, even the government's own evidence says it would make a difference if you made the ban of no more than a Smartie a day to people's calorie intake. This is not serious policy making.
Thank you, Peter. Just to stay with the money for a moment, Owen, I think from 22-23, S4C will now be entirely funded from the license fee, and DCMS will decide what you get. How do you anticipate that's going to work for you?
Well, the first thing to say is we're quite an interesting beast, S4C, because we've been funded virtually every means possible, apart from subscription. We were funded from the Home Office as a grant. We were funded when we were created, of course, from advertising. From Channel 4 and latterly from DCMS, but increasingly from the license fee. So I think it's, Peter, your point right at the start about having an independent and hypothecated fund, from our experience, does seem to be the only logical way that you can continue this. I mean, the big difference for us is that, we're going from 2 pots to 1. It's ensuring that you have a consolidation of that. Otherwise, you could wipe out 10% of my budget before I turn around. But the biggest things really is that I think there needs to be a discussion as well about what the license fee represents. The BBC is a big beast, tends to regard the license fee as being its own sometimes. And so I think in terms of policy really about if we are going to have this hypothecated fund, what's it used for, there does need to be very, very clear delineation of this is what we expect for this money. Anyway, I think those conversations are happening. But I think the other point which we've heard is that the money is one thing, but it has to be part of a suite of policy objectives, because the money won't sort everything. Even if they put the money up for the public sector broadcasters and took away some of the policy objectives that are starting to encroach on the funding, we could fund something that could be absolutely excluded from most people's households through quite easy means by the main platforms. So I think there has to be that duality of ensuring that the funding is right for what the government wants us to deliver, but also making sure that we get access to those people who want to watch our content.
In terms of what the government wants you to do, Joe mentioned there the commission that Oliver Dowden has set up. Do you think that something will come of that process that is helpful in terms of defining what we expect from public sector broadcasting from here on? Or do you think his suggestion that actually maybe it's not needed at all means that there won't be anything there that would help bolster your case or help guide those funding decisions?
I think it's very difficult. I think it's the system at the moment is, there's some good people on there, but the system is quite opaque, as Joe mentioned. So actually understanding what they're concentrating on, it's too easy, I think, for a closed body just to pick at the bits they're interested in, rather than to sit back and think, right, what are we talking about here across the whole landscape of the public sector broadcasting system for the UK. So without having a crystal ball, I'm afraid, it's very, very difficult to see what's going to come of that.
Rebecca, could I just come back on that point?
Please do.
I was going to say, what really frustrates me about this advisory panel, public service broadcasting is our broadcasting as the public. It belongs to us. It's for us. We should have a discussion about it, all of us, in a completely transparent manner. This shouldn't be being discussed and agreed, and the government solely going to a group of people behind closed doors about it. And we should all make a fuss about that, I think.
Jo, there's an element to which this committee has been born out of, to take the title of Peter's book, A War on the BBC and Other Public Broadcasters. And obviously under the last Labour administration, as it were, under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, we got quite used to being referred to as a sort of pejorative mainstream media. Does Labour have a role to play in bolstering the importance of public service broadcasting and restoring some of its reputation in that respect?
Absolutely. I mean, I am very clear that we support the principles behind public service broadcasting. As I said, I strongly believe they should be discussed in an open and frank way that involves the entire country, not behind closed doors. And, as I said, we, hopefully at the next general election, we get a Labour government. And if we do, we would not be coming at this with a kind of hidden agenda. I don't know what the broadcasting landscape is going to look like by then, particularly if we've had legislation, but it's about finding ways to preserve what is so brilliant about our PSBs. I mean, I was thinking this afternoon about, the great moments in British life that are captured and we all share through our public service broadcasters, the Olympic opening ceremony, the royal weddings, FA Cup finals, Wales winning the Six Nations, those sorts of things. But, it's about celebrating what it's all about. And this is why I don't like this mainstream media phrase, and I don't like the way in which, for example, journalists were targeted, and everything is seen through the lens of political reporting. The BBC and the commercial PSBs are so much more than political reporting. Everything they do, the soft power that the BBC has all around the world, and so we should be celebrating that, as well as the PSBs themselves shouting more about what they do, because what they do is wonderful, and we don't want to lose it. It's like that thing, you don't know what you've lost till it's gone. We don't want to be in that position.
Rebecca, could I just add to what Jo's just said? It's very good to hear what she's just said, and I applaud her sentiments. I think we should reflect that the trusted and impartial news that Paddy Barwise referred to earlier has always been very important, because you can't have a working democracy without an informed citizenry. But it is much, much more important today than before the internet age. So the internet is the home of rumor, gossip, paranoia. It's a Tower of Babel. It's dominated by algorithms that are meant to connect you to what you will like or will agree with. It's against pluralism, against honest debate. And Paddy made a very powerful point about the vaccination, high level of vaccination in this country as well, because of the way it's been reported by unbiased media. And just look at the way what happened in the American election and the influence of Parler, Rumble, Fox News, and so on. So this is incredibly important, and I hope everybody on this webinar, all journalists, are proud of the job they do, and articulate that pride frequently to friends, family, in all public situations, because you are part of the fabric of a functioning civil society. And it is that important, and it's much more important now than it was before the internet came along.
Thank you, Peter. That's a stirring call to action. Kirill.
Yeah, I'd like to just echo what Peter's saying. I mean, one of the upsides of COVID we found in RTÉ was that audiences came back in search of reliable news and current affairs in particular. We also saw spikes in people returning for comfort and succor, also to escape from the horror of what the news and current affairs, the reliable news and current affairs were telling them in the arts and music and drama and entertainment. Now, this is an uptick due to COVID, and it is something that, as Peter says, PSBs should be driving home. The real test will be when whenever it is, we are post-pandemic, that we retain those audiences, we convince them that the reasons that they came during COVID are the reasons that they should stay.
Patrick, if I could just bring you back in, I'm conscious we might lose you shortly. When your book came out, Dominic Cummings was still sat in Downing Street plotting the demise of public service broadcasters. Decriminalisation was still potentially on the cards for non-payment of the licence fee. And I think at that stage, we weren't even sure that the licence fee was going to be the model for the next funding round. Given that all the dust has settled on that, are you more optimistic than perhaps your book maybe makes out?
Not really. I mean, I think that the salami slicing of the funding of the BBC in particular, I think the commercial PSBs are in a different situation, and I mean, they've been able to generate other revenue sources and very successfully. ITV on the production side, for instance, is a huge player now, which it wasn't 20 years ago. So I think the particular threat is to the BBC. Interestingly, the attempt to persuade the British public not to trust the BBC, and a great deal of shot and shell has been sort of expended on that, has actually been pretty unsuccessful, except with people who kind of, some older people who lean to the right, who, there's the football referee analogy that you always think the referee is, being unfair on your own side. So of course, people on the right tend to say the BBC is biased to the left and vice versa. So of course, there are people who absolutely believe that the BBC is sort of left wing. The evidence sort of doesn't really support that. And if you ask the British public, which one source would you go to for impartial news or for news you trust, the broadcasters dominate all other sources and the BBC comes top of the broadcasters. So that attempt to undermine the credibility of the BBC won't stop. The thing which is really damaging is the funding. And the most egregious thing was these two successive funding deals forced through by George Osborne with absolutely no analysis, published analysis or evidence, no public consultation, no parliamentary discussion even. The only person Osborne consulted was in 2015, during the 8 weeks after the election and before the outcome was announced. He met with Murdoch executives 6 times in unminuted meetings, and 2 of those were with Rupert Murdoch himself. Okay, so that process, I think, has led to a very bad outcome, and we should be pushed. I mean, we've talked a lot about, and Joe's talked about, the lack of transparency in this panel. Well, this is just an advisory panel, but we need more transparency. Meanwhile, we've got a funding deal currently being negotiated. The free TV licenses for the over 75s, we've had the Prime Minister who said the BBC should cough up. Okay, now these are enormous cuts. It is a welfare benefit. Relative to the BBC's funding, it's huge. Relative to other things, it's not. So for instance, the free winter fuel allowance costs 3 times as much as it would cost to give free TV licenses to every household with someone aged over 75. So, if the Labour has got on its agenda to say, we will replace the funding that was withdrawn. It was introduced by Gordon Brown as, I have to say, a bit of a gimmick. I don't think it's that well targeted, but once you've given something like that away, you can't take it back again. But if we continue to have this Prime Minister, this government, then no, I think things are going to get worse and worse and worse, mainly because of the funding, not because of lack of trust or the BBC's lost it or any of those other narratives, culture war narratives.
That was thoroughly depressing. Thank you, Patrick. Joe, do you want to pick up on that at all?
All I would say, I mean, Patrick's absolutely right about how the over 75 licence fee debacle came about. It is a hospital pass to the BBC. It is a welfare provision and policy that should be paid for by government. And the Conservatives promised to keep TV licences for the over 75s. And I have spent the last year and time before that, as have my colleagues in the shadow DCMS team, reminding the government and challenging the government at every possible opportunity that that was their promise and they've broken it. And they've still got time to fix it. I doubt they will, but they have got the time to do it.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more about audiences. Both Keating and Patrick mentioned the affection with which audiences still hold public service broadcasters, but there is still a divide between the younger audiences who are drifting off to the streaming services and the older audiences. I think, Peter, ITV, you're trying to balance, huge live audiences for things like I'm a Celebrity, but also investment for ITV Hub and BritBox, which I think younger users favour more. Is that correct?
Well, so just to say, overall, ITV has proved itself to be a pretty resilient company, given the crisis of the last 15 months, the fact that advertising last summer in 1 month fell by more than 40%, which was much more than we'd ever seen in a month in commercial television history. And at the same time, we were unable to make programs, even though Paddy's quite right to say we have built up a production company. Pre-COVID had a turnover of about 1.8 billion. So it was a substantial maker of programs, not just in the UK, but in America, in France, in Italy, and so on. It's an international company. But your point about audiences and the way they're moving is absolutely right, and we have to move with them. Now, it's not just Netflix and Amazon who are attracting younger online streaming viewers, so is the BBC and ITV. Now, we need to make further investments in it. We need to commission shows for our online services like ITV Hub and iPlayer. They need to have their own commissioning so that there are more programs there for younger viewers to watch. Often there'll be programs that they can choose to watch without advertisements. They may wish to watch them on our service, ITV Hub Plus, or on BritBox, or whatever it happens to be. And then the experience of using those online services has got to be much better than it currently is. It's not bad, it's better than it was, but it's not the same intuitive experience you get as a Netflix or Amazon subscriber. And we're putting a lot of investment into that, as we also are into ad tech. Paddy also talked earlier about Facebook and Google, who arguably, well, they've almost destroyed the newspaper model. They haven't destroyed the television model. They've certainly nibbled at it. They've gone off with all the cream cakes. They are unregulated, so that Google can have 90% of paid search in any country it operates in. You tell me any regulator who ever allowed a firm to have a 90% share of a market, and I will give you a cream cake. But that's happened. But so to compete with Google and Facebook, who basically allow programmatic buying and targeted impacts, we've got to invest in ad tech so we can offer those things to our viewers too. So in ITV's case, we have a platform now called Planet V. At least half of our media buyers are now directly buying impacts in the demographics they want on our video on demand services. These are relatively new, relatively young. We're going to put a lot of investment in it, and we're going to grow it. Our chief executive, Karen McCall, is very articulate and strong and determined about this. So we've got a lot to do. We've come through a difficult time. We've proved ourselves resilient. We've now got to show we're a growth company.
Oh, and I think in your case, about 2 years ago, S4C was heavily criticised for its digital offering. And since then, you've put quite a bit of effort in, and I think you're even now on TikTok.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we were, I remember back to the last austerity, we had our funding cut by 36% in a year. So I think the organisation went into a bit of a defensive crouch, and this is what these policy decisions have the impact on. We were criticised, and we were quite slow off the ball. In fairness, we hadn't had a huge amount of money to invest in it, but we have invested quite heavily. But it's interesting, over the past 2 years in particular, we've invested as much in digital news as we have in digital. So yes, we have invested in platforms, we've invested in the technology, we've invested in our player, because we need them out there. Not enough that, in any way that I could compete against ITV Hub or BBC iPlayer. But we have invested to make sure at least we've got that access. But our main challenge is that I may be on Samsung, but I'm not on Philips or Sony or Panasonic or Skybox or Virgin. And that's a big handicap for us. But the news is very interesting. I mean, we have a news provided by the BBC. We have a partnership with ITV for the regional structure, training journalists, and we also commission ITV to make current affairs programs for us. But the average age of the news on screen for us is about 67. And that isn't getting this impartial news to the young people that we need to be getting the news to. So for the first time ever over the past 2 years, we've gone from 0 to employing 8 journalists in-house. And that's all about, yes, it's not quite, it's not never going to be a breaking news service, but it is investigating new stories, but it's packaging, something that Channel 5 has done very successfully through ITN. It's packaging news in a way, in a format that young people want to access. So, when COVID came across, our digital news offering went up by about 170%. Hey, everyone's did. But when we started employing journalists specifically to provide the type of news that people wanted, it went up by 600%. So the investment in proper journalism that's led up to us launching our own news app, which is an aggregator coupled onto the news that we're generating, I think is 2 of the major areas that we were criticised for 3 years ago, but that we've made significant investments in. But those investments come from the main screen. The money doesn't come from a money tree. And so, these are for a small operator like us, where the base costs are quite high in investing in these types of things. It's quite difficult.
Thank you, that's fascinating. Kirill, I think over in RTÉ, your Director General, Dee Forbes, has been warning of the opposite, of actually a reduction in election and political coverage, in-depth coverage of Northern Ireland and so on, because the money's not there. What is happening there in terms of trying to build up younger audiences?
Well, I mean, obviously an awful lot of content is being put into digital, and a lot of investment is being put into digital in order to try and attract those audiences. But also, the online audiences rose hugely as well. And whereas we can sell some advertising on the digital content platforms, there's a lot more required in order to be able to sort of monetize that. I've mentioned the legislation already. I would like to make the point, aside from younger audiences and trying to provide them with the things that they're looking for, and in a way, I can't quite get my head around it as well. All broadcasters are obsessed with chasing the younger audiences, and as soon as you get them, if you're lucky enough to get them, they've gone. So it's a sort of a strange pursuit, one that has to be pursued, but there's a kind of an inherent misfortune about it or something. I would like to mention as well, and Owen has referred to this, in relation to funding public service broadcasting, specifically in relation to with RTÉ and TG Car, Cuairsaí Gaeilge, the first constitutionally official language, minority language, but indigenous language, like Welsh, like Alba. Netflix isn't going to come in and do that. And other commercial broadcasters won't suddenly, with the demise of PSB, realize that there's a minority audience that needs serving there. They may do it at the moment while public service broadcasters are providing that service. But that's also obviously, as a native Irish speaker, I have an added vested interest in it. But it is a significant part of the public service broadcasting question where we are.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yes, because I've got to sort of leave now. I mean, first of all, I'd just like to pick up what Kirill said about Netflix and all of it. I think that the PSBs and the NUJ again should emphasize all the differences between Netflix and the PSBs, and there are many in terms of, every which way. And it's not that we're against Netflix. It's what we want is both. We want a strong, properly funded, politically independent public service broadcasting system, and Netflix and so on for those willing and able to pay more for more. So it's not an either or choice. Netflix is going to be there, and we all love the good things it does, but there are so many things it doesn't do, and that's That's not what it's for. And I think we haven't sufficiently communicated that. And just as a final point, I'll come back to what I said, that if the BBC's public funding had simply kept pace with general inflation, not, rising content costs and rising distribution, just general inflation, then today it would be annually almost 1.4 billion higher. That would enable it to do all the investment in tech and in content and services for younger viewers without cutting its news investment and its investment in BBC4 and all those other things which appeal maybe more to older and more traditional viewers. It's been put into this situation by George Osborne. So a thing which I have to say make me very happy would be to see people burning George Osborne's effigy in the streets, because that's the real culprit for the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Patrick. Thank you for your time. Let's just talk a little bit more about the point you make there about making the case as to why you need public service broadcasters as well as Netflix and co. Joe talked earlier about wanting to see more cooperation between the public service broadcasters. I wonder, Peter, if you can see some scope for that.
Yeah, well, so Joe was quite right. And this requires a sea change, not just in what the public service broadcasters, how they do business, but also in the regulatory environment. And the classic case of complete regulatory collapse and disaster was the banning of Kangaroo 10 years ago, when the public service broadcasters got together and said, we can see the future, it's about streaming, we're going to set up a joint PSB streaming service, and the Competition and Markets Authority, which was then had a different name, said you can't do it. It's anti-competitive. They had, one, misunderstood where the market was going, tragically. Secondly, they had misinterpreted consumer interest as being not what the consumer can get this week or month at a certain price, but what is in the consumer's interest over the next 20 years in terms of what they are delivered by the system. And so we don't want to go back to that. So the fact that Ofcom, as Joe said earlier, is coming up with its full report on proposals is one part of this. So the other part is collaboration. So BBC and ITV, yes, they share the Six Nations rugby. ITV makes Line of Duty, one of BBC's most successful programs. Our company World makes that for them. We collaborate, I think, as Jo herself alluded to earlier, to BritBox, which is both a domestic service, but also a way of, it's a piece of cultural diplomacy, soft power. That's now got 1.7 million subscribers in America. It's now launched in Australia and will be launched in South Africa shortly. And so those sorts of cooperations are important. And I think in the future, there will be other ways we need to cooperate, which is critically, if I go back to the point I made right at the top, if I may, Rebecca, when we come to the point where we do have a serviceable way of bringing the supranational monopoly internet giants to the table and saying you must give prominence, access and fair value to public service broadcasting programs, that's when the PSBs have got to put their heads together, not squabble, but say, can it be one sensible lozenge that's the PSB lozenge, or is it, what is it that's simple that appears on the homepage of the services we're talking about, and there'll be 40 or 50 of them, by the way, that gets you into the PSB environment in a fair way, not BBC getting advantage of ITV or vice versa. So there's a lot to be done there and a lot of talking to be done, but I believe the will is there.
Thank you. And Owen, obviously you mentioned before your cooperation with ITV already, but we're talking about cooperation here on a political level at a bigger scale. Can you see that happening?
I can. You know, at the end of the day, we compete. But Peter's right, we've got to come together, because the existential threat really of being excluded from these platforms is so great that I can't see any choice to it. It's an issue. You know, we are a small broadcaster, TG Gahara, a small broadcaster. Indigenous languages, you know, they are not hugely spoken. And so the danger for us as a small organization is that we can be just subsumed or swamped. And I think that's one of the areas where, you know, when you have absolute market failure, and Carol, you were talking about this, when you've got absolute market failure, then this is where the state needs to intervene more than any. And so I think, there is a big policy discussion about, yes, at the macro level, how you make sure that almost a walled garden of the PSBs have that access to market, but also that, let's be proud of the fact the UK does have Indigenous languages and make sure they're properly represented there.
Rebecca, if I could just reference, I see on the Q&A column that Ronan Brady has said, surely Google isn't God. Well, Ronan, actually, pretty well the equivalent. They say God is everywhere. Well, Google is everywhere too.
Thank you, Peter. So look, over the past hour, we've counted through some of the many challenges facing public service broadcasters. We've talked a lot about money, which is obviously crucial, but also about platforms and the control they may have, Google being God, as Peter says, or close enough to. And of course, the attitude of the government, the secretive commission that we have underway here, the commission in Ireland as well, that will potentially dramatically change the public service broadcasting landscape and in short order. But I want to finish on an upbeat note in case anyone was feeling a little bit depressed by some of the analysis there. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to give us a reason to be cheerful, perhaps something they've seen in the past year or a prediction for coming years that gives us a little bit of hope for our public sector broadcasting. Who would like to go first? Maybe Joe.
I'm going to have to say the rugby, rugby and the cricket, and it kept me going during lockdown. Not being able to go down to the Blues and watch them play, not being able to go to Spire Gardens and watch Glamorgan play. That's what's kept me going, and I think it's kept a lot of people going as well. But there's one other point that I think is a big positive that should underpin all our thoughts about what the challenges are for the future, and that is about how PSBs are integral to the production ecology that we've got in this country that has a huge return for the economy. And everybody plays their part in that. It's a real weapon in terms of a good weapon to have, and we should shout about it more, because in amongst all of that are people and talent, and we need to look after them and sustain them and let them thrive.
Thank you, Joe. Kirill, your reason to be cheerful.
Yeah, I'm going to borrow from a Welsh great and say that I'm holding out for a hero in the shape of a modern Friedrich Nietzsche who will tell us when God is dead. Otherwise, I don't know. I like to believe in maybe what people have realized during COVID is that there are certain things in life that have a certain intrinsic inherent value, and that people will realize that PSBs will give you a lot of that. Commercials aren't really as interested in that kind of thing.
Thank you. Owen.
I think, just to pick up on Joe's point, for the first few months when there was no sport, all we did was repeat Welsh games. It's the first time we haven't lost a match in 6 months. But I think, the big thing we've had, to Peter's point about, it being the year of the PSB, a lot of people had a lot of time of introspection over the past year in particular. And the way that people have flocked to the PSBs for nostalgia, for news, for education, for all the things that make public sector broadcasting good, I think, it can't be ignored. So I just think, the number of people that we get talking to us that have relied on what we do just gives you a real social purpose to what we do.
Thank you. And Peter.
So Owen's bagged the point you made at the top, quoting me as saying it was the PSB's finest hour. So he's bagged that one. So I'll go somewhere else. Look, the enormous creativity and cultural strength of our programme making is a wonder to behold. It's much admired around the world. It has the advantage of being in the English language, which is why many people want to buy it. The range, the cultural depth, the fact that when I turn on a soap opera, I see all the social issues that we are concerned about unpacked and examined. So the way that PSB is still a part of the vital national conversation, defining who we are, what our values are. This is fantastically inspiring. It's good. It is still going on. It ain't dead. By no means is it dead. There's life in that body yet. And if we get this right, it can continue for another 10 or 20 years. And anyway, it feeds into all the other stuff. The Netflix, the great dramas on Netflix written by some brilliant British writers, great British actors. They're wonderful too, and they rely on this wellspring of talent that is nurtured from a very early age by the PSBs making that investment. So it's a win-win.
Thank you very much. And certainly a wellspring of talent on our panel this evening. So thank you very much to Peter Bazalgette, Professor Patrick Barwise, who's left us already, Joe Stevens, Owen Evans and Keating Síocháin. And thank you, of course, to all of you for joining us this evening and listening to our conversation. If you want to see it again, there will be a recording available on the NUJ website. And if you have an appetite for more this evening, at 6:30, there is an event commemorating the life of Lyra McKee, the journalist killed, of course, covering unrest in Northern Ireland. So that's 6:30, and you can join that by following the link on the NUJ website. Thank you all very much and good night.